Across the vast centuries that separate us from the dawn of Western civilization, few legacies endure with the same strength and permanence as that of Rome. Rome is not merely an ancient city, nor just a fallen empire confined to the pages of history books. It is, above all, an idea that has survived the erosion of time, shaping the very foundations of our language, our laws, our cities, our institutions, and even our daily rituals. When the word Rome is spoken, it conjures images of military glory, sublime oratory, marble temples, marching legions, and senators in togas debating the fate of worlds. But what remains unseen, and therefore even more powerful, is the seed that Rome planted in the very soul of Western culture. A legacy that extends far beyond ruins or monuments. It lives on in the words we speak, in the codes we follow, and in the values we uphold. The trajectory of Roman civilization spans nearly 1,200 years of continuous history, from the legendary times of the monarchy of kings to the ultimate collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the year 476 after Christ. And even after the fall of the empire, Roman culture did not dissolve. On the contrary, it overflowed into the so-called barbarian peoples who had conquered it, was embraced and reinterpreted by the Catholic Church, was reborn with intensity in medieval universities, and was glorified during the Renaissance. Indeed, across the centuries, Rome has been successively rediscovered, celebrated, adapted, and continues to be. Each generation in the West, whether knowingly or not, drinks from Roman fountains in its search for social organization, aesthetics, education, and political power. From the beginning of the modern age to the present day, the myth of Rome has become one of the pillars of European identity. Kings and emperors proclaimed themselves Caesars or Augusti. Architects replicated forums, domes, and triumphal arches. Lawmakers studied Roman law as a fundamental legal standard, and modern republican systems were designed in the image of the Roman Republic, complete with senates, magistracies, and separation of powers. Even modern languages, especially those derived directly from Latin, are a living continuation of the speech that once echoed in Roman forums and among Roman legions. This influence stretches far beyond Europe, reaching the Americas, Africa, and parts of Asia through colonization, evangelization, and the globalization of European systems modeled after Roman structures. It is impossible to fully understand modern culture without excavating its Roman roots. When a court delivers a sentence, when a student learns grammar, when a building displays Corinthian columns, when a constitution guarantees civil rights, in all these actions there are Roman traces, remnants of a civilization that codified power, aesthetics, knowledge, and order so effectively that it has endured across millennia. The Roman influence is not an archaeological remnant. It is a living structure that organizes the language, logic, and functioning of contemporary societies. This is not about nostalgia or romanticism. It is about recognizing that we live, in many respects, in a continuation of Roman culture, even if many remain unaware of it. And as we dive into this script, we will uncover how this legacy manifests itself with astonishing precision, in the words we use to express ideas, in the institutions that govern us, in the symbols that surround us, in the rhythms of the calendar we follow. We will see that Rome was not merely an ancient civilization, but the invisible mold of the modern world. Its borders have been surpassed, its empire extinguished, but its influence endures. For Rome, more than a capital or an empire, was, and still is, a founding principle of civilization. And this is the starting point of our journey. Among the greatest legacies left by Roman civilization, none is perhaps as profound, as present, and as structurally significant as its language, Latin. The language of the Caesars not only unified a colossal empire, stretching from African deserts to Germanic forests, from the Iberian mountains to the banks of the Euphrates, but also laid the foundations for the languages spoken today by over 1 billion people across the globe. It is through Latin that Rome continued to live, even centuries after the collapse of its imperial institutions. This linguistic continuity, as natural as it is invisible to modern speakers, is the golden thread that links antiquity to modernity with an almost magical precision. From Portuguese to Romanian, from French to Spanish, including Italian, all of these languages are, in essence, evolved and regionally adapted forms of vulgar Latin, the language of the Roman people, shaped over the centuries by the cultural, phonetic, and historical transformations of each land. The essential distinction between classical Latin, used in Senate speeches, in Virgil's poetry, and in Cicero's letters, and vulgar Latin, spoken in the streets of Pompeii and along the borders of the empire, is crucial for understanding the birth of the Romance language family. Classical Latin was formal, stylized, and conservative. Vulgar Latin was dynamic, flexible, and adaptable. It was precisely this flexibility that ensured its survival and evolution, giving rise to the various languages that today dominate southern Europe and much of Latin America. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the year 476 after Christ did not mark the sudden disappearance of the language. On the contrary, Latin remained the language of the church, of diplomacy, of law, and of science for more than 1,000 years, while its popular form kept evolving in the voices of peasants, soldiers, merchants, and monks who lived across the former imperial territories. The evolution of Latin into Portuguese, Spanish, and French was marked by slow, cumulative phonetic and morphological transformations, changes that were deep but astonishingly consistent. The Latin word aqua became agua in Spanish, agua in Portuguese, and eau in French, all distinct forms, yet all derived from the same common root. Likewise, domus, which meant house, gave rise to domicile in French, domo in Italian, and domicilio in Portuguese. The very structure of the sentence, the use of definite articles, the subject-verb-object order, and the verb conjugation systems rooted in Latin are all direct inheritances from the mother tongue. But this legacy is not merely formal, it is cultural. The Roman vocabulary carried with it the worldview of Roman civilization. When we inherit Latin, we also inherit the way the Romans named and conceptualized reality. That is why the Romance languages are not simply modern variations of an ancient grammar. They are living repositories of the Roman mind. When we say civilization, we are using a word derived from civicis, the Roman citizen. When we speak of justice, we evoke justitia, a legal concept central to Roman law. When we refer to time, history, memory, or progress, all of these ideas are expressed using terms passed down directly from the Latin lexicon. Language shapes thought, and Western thought was molded in Roman frameworks. We study, debate, legislate, judge, and teach using vocabulary derived from Latin. This is not just an etymological fact, it is a civilizational reality. Moreover, the colonial expansion of the Iberian empires, especially the Portuguese and Spanish, between the 15th and 19th centuries after Christ, carried the Romance languages to new continents, expanding Latin's influence to millions of speakers in the Americas, Africa, and parts of Asia. Brazil, for example, today the largest Portuguese-speaking country in the world, is a direct linguistic and cultural continuation of the Roman legacy, even if many of its citizens have never formally studied Latin. Every conjugated verb, every sentence structure, every idiomatic expression used by a Portuguese speaker carries centuries of Roman history. The same is true of Spanish in the Americas, of French in Canada and North Africa, and of Italian in its diasporas. Finally, it is important to remember that Latin is not merely an ancestral language. It is still taught in universities, recited in masses, printed on coats of arms, and used as a technical language in biology, law, philosophy, and medicine. No other dead language is so alive as Latin, and that is because Rome did not die. It transformed. And in the form of the Romance languages, Rome continues to speak and to be heard every day in every corner of the world. The language of emperors remains alive on the tongues of the people, and that is perhaps the most powerful proof that the Roman spirit has never been extinguished. Although Rome's linguistic legacy is most visibly preserved in the Romance languages, such as Portuguese, French, Spanish, and Italian, its influence extends far beyond the boundaries of those tongues directly derived from vulgar Latin. Latin as the language of scholarship, religion, science, diplomacy, and jurisprudence throughout the Middle Ages and much of the modern age left indelible marks even on languages that do not belong to the Romance family. Through the transmission of knowledge, culture, and Roman institutions, Germanic languages such as English, German, and Dutch became deeply Latinized, at least in vocabulary, lexical structures, and categories of thought. And this penetration of Latin was not superficial. It reached the very core of modern linguistic systems, especially in the domains of law, science, religion, and administration. The most emblematic example of this influence is the English language. Though its grammatical base derives from Anglo-Saxon Germanic languages, the vocabulary of modern English is, to a great extent, Latin. It is estimated that over 60% of English words have Latin origins, either directly or indirectly, especially following the Norman conquest of England in the year 1066 after Christ. The Normans brought with them Old French, a Romance language full of Latin-derived terms, and imposed it as the official language of the English elite for more than 3 centuries. Thus, words related to law, justice, court, judge, to administration, government, council, office, to religion, divine, sacrament, altar, and to science, temperature, gravity, biology, were gradually incorporated into English vocabulary. These words were not merely added. They became the very core of formal, technical, institutional, and academic discourse. Even in the fields of medicine and biology, Latin vocabulary predominates. The scientific names of animal and plant species by international convention are expressed in Latin or Latinized forms. A lion is classified as Panthera leo, a human as Homo sapiens, a sunflower as Helianthus annuus. Modern biology is written, almost literally, in Latin, and this is not merely due to tradition, but to the pursuit of a universal, neutral, and precise language, qualities that Latin, being a dead and therefore stable language, offers with unmatched excellence. The same is true in the realm of international law, where Latin expressions such as habeas corpus, ex officio, de facto, sub judice, in flagrante delicto, and per se are widely used in courts across the globe, regardless of the national language. In German, Latin influence is less visible, but still profoundly significant, especially in technical and philosophical domains. Words such as Kultur, nation, Universität, Justiz, religion, and moral are derived from Latin, directly or via French or ecclesiastical Latin. Moreover, the philosophical language of German, which shaped thinkers like Kant, Hegel, and Nietzsche, is deeply influenced by Latin conceptual categories such as causa, substantia, persona, ratio, virtus, and natura. These words structure Western thought so deeply that even in translation, they retain the semantic weight that Rome bestowed upon them. This influence also extends to other languages, such as Polish, Swedish, Hungarian, and even Russian, particularly in academic and liturgical contexts. Even in languages with distinct alphabets, such as modern Greek, Arabic, or Cyrillic scripted Russian, we find Latin traces in recent linguistic borrowings from the fields of science, medicine, politics, and international law. When we speak of democracy, democratia, constitution, constitutio, republic, res publica, president, praesidens, or university, universitas, we are, often unknowingly, echoing linguistic reverberations of Rome. And not only in words, the very logic by which we classify ideas, concepts, and phenomena is inherited from the Roman tradition of naming, defining, and categorizing the world, a legacy that survives in manuals, libraries, and contemporary discourse. Furthermore, the way modern languages organize technical vocabulary, separating common usage from scholarly discourse, colloquial speech from legal or scientific language, is a direct inheritance from Roman culture. In Rome, Latin was already split between vulgar and classical forms, between the language of the marketplace and that of the Senate. This model endured. Even today, we speak one way at home and another in court, at university, or in official documents. This linguistic dichotomy is not natural. It is a cultural product, and its origin is Roman. In short, even those who have never heard a prayer in Latin, who have never studied Roman declensions or conjugations, still live immersed in a web of words born in Rome. The vocabulary we use to think, to legislate, to heal, to teach, and to govern is still rooted in Latin. And this influence, though silent, is one of the most powerful manifestations of Rome's permanence in the contemporary world. Rome continues to speak, not only through the languages that descend from it, but through all those that have studied it, imitated it, and absorbed it. Latin is not merely the language of an extinct people, it is the invisible skeleton of the words that shape our very thoughts. When examining the persistence of ancient Rome in the modern world, it is common to focus on monuments, institutions, or laws. However, there is one field where the Roman legacy reveals itself in an almost imperceptible yet profoundly influential way: the grammatical and syntactic structure of modern languages. Rome did not merely leave us words, it taught us how to articulate ideas. By shaping Latin into a highly logical, flexible, and systematic language, the Romans created a linguistic architecture so solid that its foundations still support the way we communicate today. It is not merely about the vocabulary we inherited, but about the very way we organize verbal thought, how we connect subjects, verbs, and objects, how we qualify, subordinate, contrast, enumerate, and justify arguments within a sentence. Latin was, by excellence, a language of clear structure and well-defined function. Its system of grammatical cases, nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, ablative, and vocative, allowed for remarkable syntactic flexibility, as the position of words within a sentence was less important than the grammatical role they played, identified through their endings. A subject could appear at the end of the sentence, a direct object at the beginning, without any loss of meaning, because each word carried its functional identity within its morphology. This demanded from the speaker a precise mental organization and constant awareness of the statement's internal logic. When the cases began to fade during the evolution from classical Latin to the vulgar Latin of the Romance languages, this system was replaced by a stricter word order and greater reliance on prepositions. But the structural logic endured. Subject-verb-object became the standard, and syntactic roles came to be indicated not by endings, but by position and auxiliary particles. This transition gave birth to a syntactic model that still dominates much of the modern Western linguistic landscape. In Portuguese, for instance, we use constructions such as o homem viu o cão, the man saw the dog, where word order determines meaning, and this reflects directly the simplification of the Old Latin model. The logic of constructing subordinate clauses, the use of conjunctions such as because, although, in order that, in case, and therefore has clear roots in the Latin tradition, especially in legal and rhetorical writings. Terms such as subordinate, conjunctive, conditional, relative, and modal are all grammatical categories inherited from Roman linguistic thought, initiated by grammarians like Donatus and Priscian, whose works were copied and studied for centuries in medieval monasteries and Renaissance universities. The impact of Latin grammar was not limited to the Romance languages. The very idea that a sentence should have a subject, a verb, and a predicate is an abstraction inherited from Roman grammar, itself inspired by classical Greek models, but adapted with Roman practical rigor. The grammatical tradition of the West was written in Latin and based on the analysis of Latin. Throughout the Middle Ages and up to the 18th century after Christ, scholars studied the grammar of their native languages through Latin structures. English, German, Dutch, all of these languages were understood, organized, and taught using Latin grammatical categories. This is still reflected in modern terminology. We speak of the nominative case in German, of the accusative in Russian, of verbal conjugation in French, of declension in Latin and Greek, all Roman concepts that have traversed the centuries. Another reflection of this heritage is found in the logical construction of written argumentation. The way we organize essays, legal opinions, scholarly articles, and academic speeches follows a Roman tradition. Introduction, development, and conclusion are distant echoes of the structure of Latin oratory, as exemplified in the speeches of Cicero and Quintilian. Rhetoric itself, understood as the art of persuasion through speech, was an essential component of Roman education, and its influence survives today in writing manuals, journalistic structures, and argumentative models used throughout the Western world. When we use expressions like firstly, consequently, could, in conclusion, or second point, we are employing logical connectors created or systematized by the Romans. Moreover, the formal standard of modern languages is almost always defined according to parameters inherited from classical Latin. The notion of linguistic correctness, the distinction between popular and scholarly usage, and the very concept of normative grammar, all of these developed from the reverence for classical Latin as an ideal linguistic model. By establishing a fixed and ideal form of expression, Rome laid the foundation for what we now call school grammar. Thus, when we correct a comma, avoid ambiguity, or strive for precision in the use of pronouns, we are following a Roman mental model, and even those who have never formally studied Latin still, by cultural inertia, follow principles established by the Romans more than 2,000 years ago. Thus, whenever we speak, write, read, or even think linguistically, we are treading the grammatical paths that Rome paved. The syntactic structures that seem natural, obvious, or inevitable are in fact inherited cultural constructs. Latin taught the West how to organize ideas with clarity, elegance, and precision, and this heritage is so embedded in modern language that it often goes unnoticed, like the air we breathe. Yet it is there, in every subordinate clause, every compound sentence, every logical progression of thought. Rome did not merely leave behind words, it left the very way we use them. Few Roman legacies have shaped the modern world as profoundly as law. Rome, more than any other civilization of antiquity, understood that power can only endure with legitimacy when supported by a coherent, rational, and enduring legal system. And it was precisely this rationalization of human relationships, the attempt to transform conflict into norms and custom into code, that made Roman law the foundation of civil organization across Western societies. Over the course of more than 1,000 years of history, the Romans built, adapted, and consolidated a body of law that not only regulated the vast territories of their empire, but also survived its fall and continued to guide the public and private lives of Europeans for centuries, directly influencing modern constitutions, civil codes, and the very notion of justice as we understand it today. The starting point of this monumental construction was the Lex Duodecim Tabularum, or Law of the 12 Tables, compiled in the mid-5th century before Christ. Engraved in bronze and displayed in the Roman Forum, this first written codification of Roman law laid down basic legal principles accessible to all citizens, a true democratic revolution for its time. For the first time, the law ceased to be the monopoly of priests and aristocrats and became public domain. The 12 Tables addressed themes such as property, contracts, inheritance, family, and penalties, establishing the basis for the future development of Roman civil law. This founding structure reflected the practical spirit of the Romans, clear, predictable rules based on the realities of daily life and the ideal of equity. As the empire expanded, Roman law evolved alongside it. New statutes were enacted, magistrates established legal precedents and jurisconsults, legal scholars wrote treatises and opinions interpreting and systematizing the application of norms. The result was a complex yet remarkably organized legal body that allowed tradition and innovation to coexist, as well as custom and codification, norm and exception. During the classical period, from the 1st century before Christ to the 3rd century after Christ, Roman law reached an extraordinary level of sophistication, with principles that still guide legal systems across much of the world. The doctrine of pacta sunt servanda, agreements must be kept, the concept of legal personality, inheritance rights, good faith in transactions, civil liability, the presumption of innocence, and even the principle that no one can be tried twice for the same offense all originated with Roman jurists. The definitive consecration of Roman law came under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century after Christ. In one of the most ambitious legal undertakings in history, Justinian ordered the compilation of all Roman law up to that point, collecting laws, decrees, opinions, and interpretations into a monumental work, the Corpus Juris Civilis, or Body of Civil Law. This codification, composed of the Codex, the Institutes, the Novellae, and the Digest, became the foundation of legal education throughout medieval and Renaissance Europe. Studied in the universities of Bologna, Paris, and Salamanca, it laid the groundwork for the civil codes that would be written centuries later, including the Napoleonic Code and the Brazilian Civil Code. Even in countries of the Anglo-Saxon legal tradition, such as the United States and the United Kingdom, Roman principles influenced specific areas of law, especially contract, commercial, and international law. The impact of Roman law extends beyond the letter of the law. It shaped the very concepts of citizenship, sovereignty, and justice. The figure of the civis Romanus, the Roman citizen endowed with rights and duties before the state, later inspired the formulation of modern citizenship. The idea that all individuals should be equal before the law, that the state must be governed by rules and not arbitrary will, that judges must be impartial, and that due process must follow defined stages, all of this is deeply rooted in Roman legal practice. More than that, the Romans viewed law as a science, an art, and a craft. It was not merely an instrument of power, but a rigorous field of study with its own methodology, specialized terminology, and a robust doctrinal corpus. Today, when a judge issues a ruling, when a lawyer interprets a civil code, when a citizen signs a contract or registers property, they are, consciously or not, echoing Roman formulas. The very structure of many modern courts, their rituals, robes, and terminologies, are inherited from the legal apparatus built by the Romans. Terms like jurisprudence, advocacy, testament, clause, sentence, forum, court, penalty, appeal, and motion are all direct lexical inheritances from Latin legal tradition. And this is not merely about words. It is a way of thinking and organizing human coexistence through law. Rome taught us that law is not only repression, but also guarantee, not only punishment, but protection, not only power, but its limit. That is why studying Roman law is not merely an academic or archaeological exercise. It is an exploration of the living foundations of the legal institutions that regulate our everyday lives. It is the rediscovery, beneath layers of time, of the invisible hand of a civilization that uniquely understood the transformative power of legal norms. Rome, in founding its empire of laws, also founded an empire of legal thought, one that lives on today in codes, courtrooms, and constitutions across the globe. And in that invisible empire, the modern citizen continues, unknowingly, to walk in the shadow of Rome's scales of justice. When contemplating the great modern cities, their straight avenues, central squares, monumental arches, imposing public buildings, and underground sanitation systems, it becomes impossible not to recognize the invisible hand of Rome. The Roman civilization, with its obsession for order, functionality, and monumentality, not only built extraordinary works for its time, but also established the fundamental principles of Western urbanism. In founding colonies and administrative centers throughout the empire, the Romans designed cities as living organisms, articulated through a logic of power, circulation, and public coexistence. They did not build merely to shelter. They built to organize, to control, to educate, and above all to impress. And this architectural logic, profoundly symbolic, still echoes in contemporary urban projects. Every modern capital that displays a parliament framed by Corinthian columns, every symmetrical plaza surrounded by institutional buildings, every triumphal arch crossed by crowds, all of it is, knowingly or not, a tribute to eternal Rome. The basic layout of Roman cities was a true imperial signature. In nearly every corner of the empire, from Britannia to Syria, from Germania to Egypt, the Romans replicated the orthogonal urban model based on two main axes, the Cardo Maximus, running north-south, and the Decumanus Maximus, running east-west. The intersection of these axes housed the Forum, the civic heart of the city. There one would find administrative buildings, temples, markets, courts, and monuments. Surrounding the Forum, the Romans organized residential districts, baths, theaters, amphitheaters, aqueducts, and often city walls with watchtowers. This geometric logic was not merely aesthetic, it was functional. It enabled military control, rational distribution of resources, efficient traffic flow, and a clear visualization of imperial authority. But Roman architecture was not merely technical, it was a language of power. Every structure erected sought to convey grandeur, permanence, and dominion. The use of the perfect semicircular arch, the vault, and the dome allowed the Romans to create large covered spaces with structural efficiency previously unseen in antiquity. This architectural revolution was enabled in part by the technical mastery of concrete, opus caementicium, a resistant and versatile material that allowed for the erection of monumental buildings and their rapid replication across different regions of the empire. With it, the Romans built baths such as those of Caracalla and Diocletian, rivaling modern stadiums in scale. They raised domes like that of the Pantheon, which, with a diameter of over 40 meters, remained the largest in the world for centuries. and they erected amphitheaters like the Colosseum, capable of housing more than 50,000 spectators with access engineering that would later inspire modern stadium design. Equally impressive was the urban functionality that accompanied these monuments. The Romans designed their cities with underground sewage systems, such as the Cloaca Maxima in Rome, public roads paved with slopes for water drainage, fountains fed by aqueducts stretching for tens of kilometers, and residential zones planned according to social class, commerce, and proximity to administration. The insulae sun, multi-story apartment buildings, already reflected a population density and a concept of collective housing that would not reappear until centuries later. Roman urbanism was simultaneously pragmatic and symbolic. Every structure, from the temple to the market, from the road to the wall, existed to affirm the Roman ideal of civilization in contrast to so-called barbarian chaos. And this model, in its forms and functions, did not vanish with the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It was absorbed by medieval Christendom, which adapted Roman basilicas into churches, maintained the use of forums as administrative centers, and preserved public road routes as commercial axes. During the Renaissance, architects such as Leon Battista Alberti and Andrea Palladio not only studied Roman ruins, they copied, reinterpreted, and systematized their principles. The neoclassicism of the 18th century after Christ, which dominated European and American capitals, was an explicit declaration of fidelity to Roman aesthetics. Legislative palaces with triangular pediments, Doric colonnades in courthouses, domes inspired by the Pantheon crowning universities and parliaments. Even Brasilia, the futuristic capital of Brazil designed by Lucio Costa and Oscar Niemeyer, owes its axial, monumental, and symbolic organization to Roman urbanism reinterpreted through modernism. Today, when walking through Washington, Paris, Berlin, Buenos Aires, or even central districts of São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, one finds public buildings that resonate with the language of Rome. The symmetry of plazas, the hierarchy of buildings, pedestals with statues, commemorative arches, all of it echoes the architectural vocabulary and spatial logic of ancient Roman engineers. And this influence goes beyond form. It reaches meaning. A central plaza is still for us a space of citizenship, debate, and political assembly, just as the Forum once was. The courthouse is designed to be monumental, not only for aesthetic reasons, but to inspire respect, just as Roman temples of justice once did. In many aspects, the modern city remains an invisible Rome. In summary, the architecture and urbanism we have inherited from the Romans are not merely a preserved aesthetic. They are a way of thinking about public space, of structuring social interaction, of giving physical form to the ideals of order, hierarchy, functionality, and power. Rome taught the West that to build is more than to raise walls. It is to project ideas into space. And these ideas continue to be inhabited, crossed, and contemplated by millions of people every day. Wherever a city is organized with a civic axis, symbolic monumentality, and spatial rationality, Rome lives on, in stone, concrete, and thought. When tracing the roots of modern democratic regimes, sooner or later, we inevitably turn our gaze to Republican Rome. Centuries before the rise of British parliamentarianism, the French Revolution, or the Constitution of the United States of America, the Romans had already conceived a complex, balanced, and deeply articulated system of government. Between the 6th and 1st centuries before Christ, Rome stood out for building a republic based on institutions that remarkably combined the elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. This tripartite division of power, admired by philosophers such as Polybius and Cicero, would profoundly influence the founders of modern nation-states. When we observe bicameral parliaments, periodic elections, separation of powers, and institutional checks today, it is impossible not to recognize the echoes of the Roman Republic pulsing beneath the surface of contemporary democracies. The Roman Senate, known as Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and the people of Rome, was the backbone of the political system. Composed of members from the aristocratic elite, the senators exercised deliberative, legislative, consultative, and even diplomatic functions. Although their authority was not executive, their influence over magistrates and foreign policy was immense. This idea of a council of elders, with lifetime appointments and a moderating role over executive power, was widely imitated throughout history. The very name Senate has been adopted by countless nations, from the United States Senate to the French Senate, including Brazil's Federal Senate, as a symbol of wisdom, stability, and political prudence. Another fascinating aspect of the Roman Republic was its system of annual and collegial magistracies, in which the top offices of the state were filled by elected citizens with short, often shared, mandates. Consuls, for example, led the government and the army, but always in pairs, to prevent abuses of power. This institutionalized mistrust of concentrated authority inspired centuries later modern mechanisms of checks and balances among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. The figure of the tribune of the plebs, a magistrate with veto power and the role of protecting the rights of common citizens, is a remote predecessor of the public defender and popular representation bodies. The praetors, with judicial functions, foreshadowed the separation between the roles of judging and governing, an essential principle of modern republics. Roman elections, though restricted to a property-owning male elite, set important precedents for Western political culture. Roman citizens voted in assemblies divided by class and function, electing magistrates and approving laws. There were electoral campaigns, public debates, and political promises. Even if all this occurred within an aristocratic logic, the idea of active civic participation was born there. The very notion of res publica, the public thing, the common good, represented a fundamental concept that would endure. The idea that the state does not belong to a sovereign, but to the collective body of citizens. This ideal, revived during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, became the nucleus of modern republicanism. The Roman model was especially inspirational during the founding of the United States of America. The founding fathers, men deeply versed in classical history, modeled their political system after the Roman Republic. The United States Congress, composed of the House of Representatives and the Senate, reflects the division between the people and the elite, while the presidency, limited by terms and subject to a system of checks and balances, is a modern reinterpretation of the Roman consulate. Even the visual symbols of power, the eagle, the fasces, bundles of rods, buildings with colonnades and domes, and the use of Latin in national mottos, e pluribus unum, annuit coeptis, senatus, are direct inheritances from the Roman Republican tradition. During the French Revolution, the ideals of libertas, equitas, and civitas were rediscovered as the foundation of a new political order. The revolutionaries saw themselves as moral heirs to Brutus, Cicero, and Cato, defenders of the Republic against the abuses of tyrants and absolute monarchs. The revolutionary calendar, the people's courts, the glorification of civic virtue, and even the naming of squares and streets, such as Place de la République or Consul Avenue, were attempts to revive the Roman spirit. In 19th century Brazil, with the proclamation of the Republic, the Roman model was once again invoked as a paradigm of modernity, citizenship, and justice. The Republican Constitution of 1891 after Christ was directly inspired by the American and French models, both descendants of the Roman system. To this day, the ideal of a republic as a domain of laws, civic participation, and limited power still reflects the Roman legacy. Even in parliamentary or presidential systems, the essence of what Rome built remains alive. Elected mandates, political representation, separation of powers, public accountability, and the idea that to govern is to serve the res publica. So, it is no coincidence that politicians, judges, lawyers, and constitutional scholars continue to study Roman law and republican institutions as theoretical and historical foundations of modern democratic order. Rome did not invent democracy as we know it today, but it gave the world a stable, durable, and replicable form of mixed government with checks and balances that still sustains the institutional architecture of free nations. Ultimately, what Rome left us was more than structures. It was a political mindset, the belief that the state should be guided by reason, that power must be limited by law, and that liberty depends on civic virtue are ideas that have endured for centuries. Rome built senates, palaces, and forums, but it also built ideas, and those ideas continue to govern the modern world in both government palaces and in the speeches delivered in public squares. The Roman Republic, though extinct, has never ceased to exist. for it lives wherever the people and the law share sovereignty. Few aspects of the Roman legacy are as present, continuous, and daily as the way we organize time. The names of the months, the structure of the year, the days of the week, and the very concept of a civil calendar, all of these are constructs whose existence, form, and permanence we owe to ancient Rome. In fact, the modern notion of chronological time, not merely as an astronomical measurement, but as an instrument of political, social, and religious administration, was systematized by the Romans with a level of precision and ambition no prior civilization had achieved. By organizing time, Rome organized the empire, and by organizing the empire, it established a standard that the Western world continues to follow to this day, more than 2,000 years later. Before the Roman reform, calendars were imprecise, uncoordinated, and often adjusted according to religious, agricultural, or political criteria. The original Roman Republican calendar was lunar, consisting of 12 months and 304 days, requiring manual intercalations to maintain alignment with the solar cycle. This system, controlled by the pontiffs, led to constant manipulations, for by deciding whether or not to add an intercalary month, the priests could influence the length of magistracies and political mandates. It was in response to this chaos that in the year 46 before Christ, Julius Caesar enacted one of the most enduring reforms in human history, the creation of the Julian calendar. With the help of the Egyptian astronomer Sosigenes, Julius Caesar established a solar calendar of 365 days, introducing the leap year every 4 years to correct astronomical drift. The months were reorganized, traditional names were retained, such as Martius Palfyrus March, honoring Mars, and Maius Barsaeus May, linked to the goddess Maia, while others were renamed in direct homage to imperial authority. Quintilis became Julius Barsu July, and Sextilis was later renamed Augustus August in honor of Octavian Augustus. This structure of months, with 30 and 31 days, with February shortened, remains practically unchanged in the modern civil calendar. The Julian calendar, with only minor adjustments, governed European time for over 1,500 years until it was slightly modified by the Gregorian reform, introduced by the Catholic Church in the 16th century after Christ, a minimal revision when compared to the solidity of Caesar's legacy. Beyond the months, Rome gave us the days of the week, whose nomenclature was based on the 7 celestial bodies visible to the naked eye and their associated deities. Dies Solis, Sunday; Dies Lunae, Monday; Dies Martis, Tuesday; Dies Mercuri, Wednesday; Dies Iovis, Thursday; Dies Veneris, Friday; and Dies Saturni, Saturday, formed a continuous cycle that structured not only religious life, but also administrative and commercial rhythms. This structure was inherited by Romance languages, adapted by Germanic languages, and consolidated by Christianity, which consecrated Sunday as the Lord's Day, Dominicus, while preserving the pagan or liturgical roots of the others. In modern Portuguese, for example, the names of the days derive entirely from Christian liturgy: Segunda-feira, Terça-feira, except for Sábado and Domingo, which preserve their Jewish and Roman origins, respectively. Rome also bequeathed us the idea of the calendar as an instrument of power. The Romans marked time according to the names of the consuls in office, the anniversaries of city foundations, and religious festivals. The year officially began in March, the month of war and spring in the Northern Hemisphere, but was later changed to January, a month consecrated to Janus, the god of doors, transitions, and beginnings, a perfect symbol for the threshold of the year. This symbolic conception of time as something that could be institutionally marked, with celebrations referring to the founding of Rome, such as the Lupercalia and Saturnalia, and the use of time as a tool of political legitimacy, all resonate in modern civic holidays, national observances, and official calendars. More than that, Rome transformed time into an essential element of public administration. The population census, conducted by the censors, was held periodically and organized the distribution of taxes, military obligations, and political rights. Political mandates, such as the consulate, lasted 1 year and began on fixed dates, creating an institutional rhythm that was maintained for centuries. The modern idea of fixed terms, legislatures with set durations, periodic elections, and governmental cycles derives directly from this tradition. The very practice of organizing public life according to a regular, predictable national calendar is a direct echo of the Roman mentality. And finally, we must not forget the influence of the Roman calendar on the Christian liturgical calendar. The Church, which inherited Latin as its language, and Rome as its symbolic center, also inherited the Roman temporal model. Christian religious holidays were strategically overlaid on Roman pagan dates. Christmas, for instance, established at the winter solstice, coincides with the festival of the birth of Sol Invictus. The Christian liturgical calendar, with its seasons of Advent, Lent, and Pentecost, was modeled after the Roman cycles of celebration and renewal. Thus, even the way the West celebrates, fasts, mourns, and rejoices on specific dates is a legacy of Rome's timekeeping. In summary, times as we understand and live it today is a Roman construct. When we consult a calendar, schedule an appointment, celebrate a national holiday, count the days of the week, or reflect on the beginning of a new year, we are navigating a system created and consolidated millennia ago. Rome did not merely conquer territories in space, it conquered time itself. And that conquest remains alive, continuous and unquestioned, marking every step of civilized life with the precision of a clock that has never stopped ticking. Among all the expressions of Roman genius, few are as vast, rich, and influential as its literature. Latin, the language of command and administration, also became a vehicle of beauty, reflection, emotion, and eternity. Alongside the Greek heritage, Latin literature stands as one of the most enduring pillars of Western culture, and not merely because of the aesthetic value of its verses or the eloquence of its speeches, but because Roman texts shape the way we write, argue, narrate, and conceive the human condition. The Roman literary tradition is not a relic. It is a living current that stretches from the lines of Virgil, Horace, and Ovid, through Cicero, Seneca, and Tacitus, all the way to inspire the great works of the Renaissance, modernity, and even contemporary times. In ancient Rome, literature was not a mere pastime. It was the core of cultured education. Mastery of oratory and rhetoric was both a civic virtue and a political requirement. It was not just about knowing words, but about knowing how to wield them to persuade, command, and inspire. Authors like Cicero elevated Latin rhetoric to a level of precision and beauty that is still studied in law and philosophy schools today. His speeches against Catiline, his legal defenses, and his treatises like De Oratore or De Re Publica are both historical documents and guides to the art of persuasion, read by generations of statesmen, jurists, and thinkers. In poetry, Rome inherited the epic, lyrical, and dramatic models of Greece, but Romanized them with a new spirit, that of imperial glory, order, and civilizational melancholy. Virgil, in his masterpiece Aeneid, recounts the mythical founding of Rome, not as a fairy tale, but as the inevitable destiny of a people chosen by the gods to civilize the world. During the Middle Ages, the Aeneid became almost a secular scripture, revered by monks and scribes, interpreted as prophecy and taught as a moral lesson. Ovid, with his Metamorphoses, inspired Renaissance art with fluid and sensual mythological tales. Horace, with his Odes, taught the ideal of balance, moderation, and ironic detachment from life. Aurea mediocritas, the golden mean, became a motto of classical wisdom. Even authors deemed decadent by Christian critics, such as Juvenal and Martial, left profound marks on later literature, with their biting satires that dissected societal vices with surgical precision and biting style. Roman prose writing also achieved levels of refinement and critical depth that inspired all subsequent Western historiography. Livy, with his Ab Urbe Condita, sought to record the entire history of Rome from its founding, an undertaking comparable to Herodotus and Thucydides, yet with the political vision of a republican who saw in history a mirror of virtue and moral decline. Tacitus, in contrast, with his histories and annals, bequeathed not only facts but profound reflections on power, corruption, and the dangers of authoritarianism in philosophically dense and somberly styled texts. Roman literature did not merely tell stories, it analyzed, criticized, and taught. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Latin literature was not lost. It was safeguarded, preserved, and reinterpreted by Christianity. The Church adopted Latin as its sacred language, and monasteries became the main centers of copying, studying, and transmitting classical works. Alongside scriptures and theological treatises, the works of Cicero, Virgil, and Seneca continued to be read, sometimes as stylistic models, other times as pagan adversaries to be overcome. But the fact is, Roman literature was never forgotten. On the contrary, it was passionately revived during the Renaissance, when Italian humanists such as Petrarch, Lorenzo Valla, and Erasmus of Rotterdam rediscovered in the classics the key to a new way of seeing man, language, and the world. The humanist literature of the 15th and 16th centuries after Christ drank directly from Roman sources. Humanists saw themselves as the legitimate heirs of classical Rome and sought to emulate its style, ethics, and worldview. The rediscovery of the Aeneid, Cicero's epistle, and Seneca's philosophical treatises inspired a new generation of writers, philosophers, and politicians. Latin, once again, became the language of scholarship and diplomacy, and classical tradition was integrated into school curricula, academies, and halls of power. Shakespeare, Cervantes, Montaigne, and Machiavelli were all, in some measure, shaped by their contact with the Roman literary world. The neoclassicism of later centuries maintained this reverence. Goethe, Rousseau, Voltaire, all engaged with Rome as a source of style and substance. Even in modern literature, after Latin ceased to be a living language, the Roman spirit persisted. The way we structure arguments, use rhetorical figures, build narrative logic, and define literary genres, all of this is a legacy of Roman literary pedagogy. And even today, studying Cicero, Virgil, or Tacitus in universities is not merely an exercise in intellectual archaeology, but a reunion with the very foundations of Western literary language. When a writer constructs an antithesis, crafts an irony, shapes a political speech, or invokes myth to illustrate a human dilemma, they are, consciously or not, using tools forged more than 2,000 years ago in the halls of the Senate, on the stages of tragedies, or in the libraries of imperial Rome. Thus, Roman literature is not a remnant of a distant past. It is the living foundation of Western writing. Rome not only built political empires, it built an empire of the word, whose echoes still resonate in our languages, schools, books, and ideas. Every well-constructed sentence, every persuasive speech, every text that seeks a balance between form and content carries, in some way, the invisible seal of the Roman tradition. Cicero's pen still guides jurists. Virgil's verses still inspire poets. And Rome's shadow continues to write with us, even when we think we're speaking alone. If there is a bridge that directly connects the Roman world to modern times, that bridge is, without a doubt, the Catholic Church. Far more than a spiritual institution, the Church was, and continues to be, the longest-standing heir of the Roman Empire. When barbarian armies crossed the imperial borders in the 5th century, after Christ and Rome could no longer maintain its political and military cohesion, it was the Church's structure that assumed the role of unifier of the Western world. And what this new spiritual authority carried was not only a new faith, but also the entire administrative, linguistic, legal, and symbolic apparatus of the empire that preceded it. Thus, Christianity did not Romanize Rome. It was Rome that Romanized Christianity. And this process, which began as early as the 1st century after Christ, profoundly shaped not only Christian doctrine and worship, but also the culture, art, architecture, canon law, and even the social organization of the West. The first major transformation occurred with the conversion of Emperor Constantine at the beginning of the 4th century after Christ. By recognizing Christianity as a lawful religion through the Edict of Milan, Constantine initiated a process that would culminate in the Christianization of the empire and the Romanization of the faith. The Church began to operate with administrative structures modeled on Roman provinces. Bishops, archbishops, and patriarchs assumed roles similar to governors and prefects. Councils began functioning as legislative assemblies, and Latin became the official language of liturgy in the West. More than that, pagan temples were converted into churches, calendars were adapted, and the very concept of ecclesiastical hierarchy was structured based on the imperial model. The figure of the Pope, successor of Peter and Bishop of Rome, gradually took on a role equivalent to that of the ancient emperor, not in the military sense, but as guardian of order, law, and unity. The title Pontifex Maximus, once used by emperors as heads of traditional Roman religion, was absorbed by papal authority, symbolizing this subtle continuity between the throne and the altar. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the papal curia emerged as the only institution with moral and organizational authority across the territory. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Church became the guardian of the Latin language, classical traditions, and territorial administration. Monasteries, cathedrals, and universities preserved the manuscripts of Cicero, Virgil, Boethius, and Augustine, keeping alive the flame of Rome amid the darkness of political fragmentation. Christian liturgy, in turn, was shaped by deeply Roman rituals. The use of incense, processions, liturgical garments, the basilica architecture of churches, Gregorian chant. All these elements are adaptations of imperial practices reconfigured under a new theology. The Latin Mass, with its solemn cadence and fixed formulas, is a fusion of spirituality and Roman legal formalism. Expressions such as Dominus Vobiscum, Agnus Dei, and Gloria in Excelsis Deo are part of a liturgical repertoire that has survived for over 1,500 years, structuring not only faith but also the collective imagination of the Christian West. In the realm of doctrine, Roman influence is also evident. Latin theology, forged by thinkers like Tertullian, Ambrose, Jerome, and above all Augustine, was written in Latin and conceived within the parameters of Roman rationalism. Canon law, the Church's legal foundation, was organized in the image of Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, adapting Roman principles of succession, property, marriage, and authority to the new ecclesiastical reality. Even today, the Catholic Church's codes continue to use Roman terminology and logic in their drafting. The very structure of theological teaching, divided into dogma, morality, exegesis, and law, echoes the functional and disciplinary division of knowledge practiced in late Roman schools. During the medieval centuries, the Church was the greatest agent in preserving Roman memory. By Christianizing barbarian kings, educating feudal elites, founding universities, and sending missionaries to the edges of the known world, it expanded not only the Christian faith, but also the foundations of Roman civilization. The missionaries who brought the gospel to Ireland, Germania, Scandinavia, and Eastern Europe also carried Latin books, Roman methods of administration, and even architectural and urban planning models. The medieval Christendom was, in many ways, a spiritualized Rome, a symbolic empire that kept alive the language, the law, the organization, and the ideal of universal unity left behind by the secular empire. And that legacy continued throughout modernity. The Protestant Reformation itself, in criticizing papal authority, made use of Roman legal concepts. The Council of Trent in the 16th century after Christ reaffirmed the Latin liturgy and doctrinal tradition based on ancient Roman models. To this day, the Vatican maintains Latin as its official language, and many of its documents are written following the tradition of classical rhetoric. The monumentality of St. Peter's Basilica, the use of the title pontiff, the liturgical calendar, and papal ceremonies are all direct heirs of Roman imperial protocol. Thus, when we look at the Church, we do not see merely a religion. We see Rome reborn in sacred vestments. The chair of Peter became the new throne of the Caesars, the Mass, the new Forum, the Curia, the new Senate, and Latin, the eternal language of an empire that never truly vanished. It only transformed. Rome, by merging with Christianity, found the eternity it had always sought. For as long as there is an altar, a prayer in Latin, a papal encyclical, or a cathedral inspired by classical order, Rome will remain, invisible but inescapable, like the living soul of a civilization that will never cease to exist. If Rome shaped the past and silently structures the institutional and cultural present of the West, it also reigns with vigor and drama over the contemporary collective imagination. Films, series, comic books, video games, historical novels, museum sculptures, and even advertising slogans carry the symbolic presence of Rome as an aesthetic, narrative, and emotional reference. The Roman Empire, with its aura of glory and decadence, honor and betrayal, martyrs and tyrants, has become an inexhaustible repository of dramatic meanings. And it is precisely this mythological power that makes Rome so present in pop culture. It is history elevated to the category of legend, the past transformed into spectacle. Wherever there are laurel crowns, marble columns, golden armor, or roaring crowds in amphitheaters, There is also the direct evocation of Rome as a universal symbol of power and tragedy. Cinema was perhaps the first modern vehicle to mythologize Rome for the masses. From the silent epics of the mid-20th century, such as Quo Vadis, 1951 after Christ, and Ben-Hur, 1959 after Christ, to more recent productions like Gladiator, from the year 2000, the film industry turns to Rome as the setting for universal dilemmas: the clash between freedom and tyranny, the moral collapse of elites, the heroism of the individual before the empire. These films not only popularize names like Caesar, Marcus Aurelius and Spartacus, but also shape a persistent iconography: monumental temples, cobbled streets, soldiers in formation, senators conspiring under torchlight, that cements in the popular imagination a Rome both real and idealized. Television in turn intensified this presence with series such as Rome, HBO 2005, Spartacus, Stars 2010, and dramatized documentaries that blend archaeology and epic storytelling. These productions, by recreating the intimacy of palace intrigues, the social conflicts between patricians and plebeians, and the daily life of gladiators, help bring Rome closer to the modern audience with realism and emotional tension. The visual language of these programs, marked by costumes, sets, and speech inspired by historical sources, reinforces the idea that Rome, though extinct, still pulses in the veins of audiovisual narrative as an aesthetic model of grandeur and drama. In comics and graphic novels, Rome is also a fertile setting. From classical adaptations of Julius Caesar or Cleopatra to more inventive works like Asterix, which satirizes the Romans through the eyes of the Gauls, Rome's presence ranges from the epic to the comic, from the tragic to the parodic. In many modern comics, Rome appears as a metaphor for contemporary society: decadent, powerful, seductive, and brutal. In titles like 300 Hours, although focused on Greece, the visual aesthetic and themes of imperial confrontation directly echo the image constructed of Rome. Even more, Rome has become a symbol in science fiction and fantasy universes, where galactic empires, such as that of Star Wars, imitate its political structure, its cult of authority, and its internal collapse. In the world of video games, digital Rome is an arena of strategy, battles, and narrative. Franchises such as Total War Rome, Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, Rise Son of Rome, and Expeditions Rome place the player in the role of generals, emperors, spies, or soldiers, recreating authentic scenarios with archaeological fidelity and historical narrative. In these games, the empire becomes a field of moral and tactical experimentation, where the player confronts the complexity of Roman politics, social reforms, Senate betrayals, and civil wars. The fascination with commanding legions, founding cities, manipulating alliances, or facing conspiracies shows how the Roman imperial structure continues to enchant and challenge the modern imagination. Beyond screens and consoles, Rome constantly appears in slogans, tattoos, logos, advertisements, and luxury products. Brands evoke names such as Imperium, Aurea, Roma, and SPQR to associate themselves with ideas of exclusivity, strength, tradition, and sophistication. The symbolism of the laurel, the gladius, the Colosseum, and the imperial eagle is used to communicate excellence, supremacy, or prestige. Restaurants, gyms, perfumes, and even cars evoke Rome in their names and campaigns, turning it into a visual code of classical power. Even in sports arenas, Roman vocabulary is frequently invoked, whether in references to gladiators, arenas, or epic battles. Roman lexicon translates competitive intensity to the modern audience. This symbolic permanence is no coincidence. Rome offers the Western imagination a magnified mirror of its ambitions and fears. It represents both civilization and barbarism, both order and decadence, both the summit and the inevitable ruin. That is why Rome never leaves the stage. It reinvents itself. In dystopian fiction, Rome is often the model for totalitarian empires. In heroic fantasy, it is the archetype of a threatened civilization. In political drama, it is the portrait of corrupted power. Rome is past, present, and warning, a civilizational myth that reminds us that glory is fragile, and that every empire, no matter how grand, carries within it the seeds of its own fall. In short, Pop culture does not merely revive Rome. It needs Rome, because within it lie the visual and moral codes through which the West recognizes itself. Rome is the ideal stage where the eternal struggles between duty and ambition, honor and betrayal, destiny and choice are played out. Each new film, series, or game about Rome is not just a journey to the past. It is a mirror of the present. And as long as there are stories to be told with grandeur, conflict, and tragedy, Rome will continue to be the perfect setting. For Rome is, by its very nature, the endless narrative. Few legacies from antiquity are as resilient, profound, and invisibly present as the educational model forged by Roman civilization, not merely for the content it transmitted, such as Latin, classical literature, imperial history, and rhetoric, but above all for the way Rome conceived the very act of education as a process of moral, intellectual, and civic formation aimed at shaping the virtuous citizen. The Roman pedagogical system, although born in dialogue with Greek tradition, developed its own distinct ethos, pragmatic, hierarchical, centered on the excellence of speech and the mastery of reason. This model would be copied, reformulated, and perpetuated for over 2,000 years. From medieval monasteries and Renaissance universities to the modern curricula of Western schools, in ancient Rome, education was initially a privilege of the patrician elite, but over the centuries it became more accessible to the urban plebeian class, especially with the growth of cities. The first stages of formal instruction began with the ludus, where boys learned to read, write, and count under the guidance of the ludi magister. Those who could progress would then attend grammar schools, led by the grammatici, where they studied literature, mythology, history, and the works of authors such as Ennius, Terence, and especially Homer and Virgil. But the pinnacle of Roman education was reached in the study of rhetoric, under the tutelage of the rhetores, where young men learned to argue, debate, organize speeches, and move crowds, essential skills for public life and political engagement in both the Republic and the Empire. This tripartite structure, reading, literature, rhetoric, was so effective that it endured for centuries, almost unchanged. In the Middle Ages, Christian monasteries preserved and replicated this model, now oriented toward the formation of the clergy and the noble elite. The trivium, consisting of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, structured the studies in monastic and cathedral schools, serving as preparation for higher education in theology, law, or medicine. And the foundation of it all was Latin, not only as a sacred language, but as a gateway to knowledge. Until the 19th century after Christ, knowing Latin was a prerequisite for full participation in European intellectual life. And that is because Rome made Latin not merely a language but a tool of civilization. The valorization of the so-called classics, works by Latin authors such as Virgil, Ovid, Horace, Cicero, Livy, and Tacitus, is also a direct inheritance from the Roman educational model. These works were not read merely for their content. They were imitated, recited, stylistically analyzed, and copied as models of elegance, precision, and noble thought. The humanist education of the Renaissance was based on this very principle. Petrarch, Erasmus, Montaigne, among many others, saw in the Roman classics the highest expression of human genius, the standard of rhetorical, ethical, and philosophical excellence. And when they founded schools, libraries, and universities, they structured the curriculum around these references. The image of the cultivated man, the enlightened citizen, was inseparable from the reading and mastery of Roman authors. This ideal was transmitted to modern universities. In institutions such as Oxford, Cambridge, the Sorbonne, or Salamanca, for centuries, the study of Latin and Roman literature was mandatory. Even in the United States, where a pragmatic and scientific spirit predominated, the liberal arts have always included learning about classical culture. In Brazil, Latin remained part of secondary school curricula until the mid-20th century, and many professors of literature, philosophy, and law were trained in the direct reading of Cicero, Seneca, and Virgil. Modern pedagogy, even when no longer explicit, still carries the structure of Roman reasoning. Introduction, development, conclusion, clear argumentation, technical vocabulary, systematic classification of knowledge. All of this is Rome in action. More than that, Rome bequeathed to the world the very idea of a curriculum, of hierarchy between disciplines, of merit-based evaluation, and of progressive formation through stages. The word discipline, used to designate branches of knowledge, comes directly from the Latin disciplina, which meant simultaneously instruction, order, and obedience. The word alumnus, which in Latin meant adopted son or protected one, reveals the role of the teacher as a quasi-paternal figure, responsible not only for instructing, but for shaping character. Even academic titles, magister, doctor, professor, have their direct origin in Roman and medieval educational practices. Roman education also influenced the way we conceive the role of knowledge in public life. For the Romans, to be educated was not merely a personal achievement, it was a civic duty. A well-educated citizen should be able to speak in the Senate, judge in court, legislate justly, write clearly, and think logically. This view of knowledge as a tool for public service was inherited by Enlightenment thought and the modern idea of active citizenship. When today we speak of forming critical citizens, teaching how to argue, or valuing humanism, we are merely translating into new words an ideal that has motivated Roman educators for over 2 millennia. Thus, the modern school, even in its most technological forms, still walks upon the foundations of ancient Rome. The classroom as a hierarchical space, the blackboard as the center of attention, the reading of classical texts, the writing of essays, the practice of debates, all of this carries in its essence the Roman pedagogical DNA. Rome did not merely teach us how to build roads, aqueducts, or laws. It taught us how to think, to learn, and to teach. And as long as there is a teacher explaining a text, a student writing an argument, or a school striving to form conscious citizens, Rome will remain. Invisible, yet irreplaceable. It is easy to recognize the grandeur of Rome in preserved monuments, in literary works, in laws, and in systems of government. But perhaps the most surprising aspect of the Roman legacy is its silent, continuous, and almost invisible presence in our most everyday habits. In simple and repeated actions, such as signing a contract, toasting with a glass, marking a date on the calendar, wearing a wedding ring, or even calling a friend a person, we are, without realizing it, echoing Roman customs that have been incorporated into Western culture over the centuries. Rome lives not only in books or films, but in the structure of our day, in social ceremonies, in civil rituals, in the words we use, in the ways we celebrate, in how we honor, and even in the way we bury our dead. Let us begin with something as routine as the very idea of a name. The Romans already used an identification system that included the praenomen, personal name, the nomen, name of the genes or clan, and the cognomen, family name or distinctive nickname, a model that would inspire modern compound names. The signing of formal documents, the importance of the surname in determining social and familial belonging, and even the creation of titles and honorary offices are practices directly inherited from this naming structure. The use of seals, rings with crests, stylized signatures, and oaths over official documents also harks back to the Roman practice of authenticating and formalizing legal and civic acts. The gesture of toasting, raising a glass in someone's honor before drinking, is another direct remnant of Roman banquets, where symbolic offerings were made to the gods or drinks were shared in the name of health and life. The very word health, uttered during toasts in various languages, carries the echo of the Roman salus, which meant both physical health and spiritual salvation. The act of offering flowers at funerals, the use of gravestones with Latin inscriptions, cremation or burial rites organized by families or institutions, all follow Roman funerary patterns adapted to Christianity and transmitted to this day in Western traditions. The practice of wearing rings as a symbol of commitment is also a Roman tradition. Roman brides and wives wore rings of iron or gold on the fourth finger of the left hand, where it was believed the vena amoris, the vein of love, ran directly to the heart. This symbolism was revived and perpetuated by Christian weddings and modern wedding bands. Similarly, the concept of a birthday as a personal celebration goes back to rites honoring tutelary deities of birth who protected each citizen from birth onward. The custom of celebrating public holidays with processions, artistic performances, and days of rest also follows the logic of the Roman feriae, sacred days that marked the religious and civic calendar. In urban life, the use of togas and ceremonial robes survives today in academic gowns, judges' robes, and the vestments of religious and civic authorities. The color purple, associated with imperial power, is still used to indicate authority in academic and liturgical garments. The symbolism of public statues, triumphal arches, and urban memorials as a way of eternalizing the memory of leaders, deeds, or events is a Roman practice that shaped modern urban planning. In contemporary cities, commemorative monuments, busts in public squares, dates engraved in stone, and civic ceremonies repeat the model of public consecration that the Romans mastered like no one else. In the field of law and civil life, the Roman legacy is even more subtle. The use of wills, the practice of legal adoption, the institution of inheritance, the celebration of written contracts, the concept of private property, and even the existence of notarial documents are all elements that originated in the Roman legal tradition and crossed centuries to become part of modern legal systems. The ritual of taking possession of property, the public reading of contracts, the requirement of witnesses, and the formalization of marriage agreements are routine behaviors that have their origins in the forums, temples, and offices of ancient Rome. Expressions from our vocabulary also carry deeply rooted Roman symbolism. When we say person, we use a word derived from the Latin persona, originally the mask worn by actors in the theater. Over time, it came to mean the social role, legal identity, and later, the individualized human being. The term civilized comes from civis, the Roman citizen, and civilitas, the expected conduct of those who participated in public life. Even the word virtue stems from virtus, a quality associated with courage, firmness, and masculine honor, essential values in Roman morality and in the formation of public character. Even the way we organize our homes reflects Roman influence. The concept of domicile, the private space as a sacred sphere, the use of atriums and inner gardens, the separation between public and intimate areas within the home, domestic altars, and family rituals on commemorative dates, all of this echoes the customs of the Roman domus. The centrality of the dining table as a symbol of family unity, the ceremonial arrangement of seats at the table, the habit of speaking words before the meal as a form of blessing or gratitude are remnants of Roman domestic rites that survive in countless Western traditions. Thus, while many associate Rome with ancient statues or imposing ruins, it is in the everyday that its most intense and lasting presence is manifested. Every formal gesture, every social rite, every small civilizational detail is a note in that cultural symphony Rome bequeathed to the world. And perhaps it is precisely this invisibility that gives the Roman legacy its most powerful force. It does not impose, it shapes. It does not stand like a statue, but follows like a shadow, discreet and constant at every step of Western civilization. Rome lives in us, not because we celebrate it with pomp, but because we repeat it without noticing. From the white marble of the imperial forums to the golden domes of Christian cathedrals, Rome transformed art into a language of power, eternity, and identity. Roman civilization did not merely absorb the artistic models of Greece, it reinterpreted, adapted, and disseminated them throughout the empire with an intentionality that surpassed aesthetics. Roman art was political, theological, didactic, and monumental. Its narrative columns, idealized portraits, palatial mosaics, and triumphal sculptures did not aim merely at beauty. They were designed to symbolically fix the ideas of glory, virtue, and authority. And it was this principle, art as a form of eternalizing power and communicating civilizational values, that shaped the entire trajectory of Western art, from the Renaissance to Neoclassicism, from Catholic Baroque to the academicism of the 19th century after Christ. Roman portraiture is perhaps one of the greatest innovations in the field of sculpture. Unlike the Greeks, who sought the idealization of the perfect body, the Romans valued everism, that is, the realistic representation of the individual with their wrinkles, marks, expressions, and idiosyncrasies. Statues of senators, magistrates, and emperors were not merely formal representations. They were monuments to a man's political journey, to his gravitas, to his contribution to the res publica. By multiplying busts throughout the empire, Rome created a model of image cult that would later be replicated by monarchs, popes, and presidents. When today we see busts in squares, official portraits in courtrooms, or coins stamped with the faces of heads of state, we are in fact witnessing a direct continuity of the Roman portrait. In monumental arts, Rome innovated by creating long-duration visual narratives. The Column of Trajan, for example, in Rome, with its over 200 meters of spiral frieze, narrates in continuous and meticulous detail the emperor's campaigns in Dacia. This fusion of art and narrative would inspire many centuries later Renaissance pictorial cycles, Baroque frescoes, and even modern comic books. The Romans understood that art could tell stories, legitimize power, and educate the people. Their triumphal arches, such as those of Titus and Constantine, fused architecture, sculpture, and visual rhetoric to eternalize victory and the grandeur of Rome. This formula, monument, narrative, symbol, was repeated throughout history in gateways, porticos, murals, and commemorative panels of every Western nation. Roman mosaics, found in palaces, baths, villas, and even modest houses, also played a central role in the aesthetic and symbolic ambience of spaces. With their mythological scenes, portraits, animals, and allegories, mosaics were not merely decorative, they were declarations of cultural belonging and status. The techniques developed by the Romans, using glass, stone, and ceramic tesserae, were preserved by the Byzantines and later inspired everything from Gothic church pavements to the stained glass windows of Renaissance cathedrals. Roman painting, although less preserved than sculpture, reveals a world of color, shadow, and perspective that astonishes with its sophistication. In Pompeii and Herculaneum, cities preserved by the eruption of Vesuvius in the year 79 after Christ, mural paintings were found depicting landscapes, mythology, portraits, and illusionistic architecture. These works show that, centuries before Giotto and Leonardo da Vinci, the Romans were already experimenting with depth, volume, and spatial composition. It is no coincidence that Renaissance artists saw in Roman ruins and images a glorious past to be revived, not as slavish imitation, but as a return to a lost ideal. It was during the Renaissance that Rome re-emerged as the definitive muse of Western art. Artists such as Michelangelo, Raphael, Bramante, and Leonardo immersed themselves in classical proportions, heroic anatomy, and harmonious forms inherited from Roman art. The very concept of beauty, as balance, proportion, and rationality, was Romanized, and with the neoclassicism of the 18th century after Christ, Rome became the canon. Sculptors like Antonio Canova recreated classical poses with refined technique. Architects raised palaces with pediments and Ionic columns. Painters depicted Caesars, Vestals, and battles as moral and political metaphors. Roman art also deeply influenced sacred spaces. The Roman basilica architecture, spacious, longitudinal with apse and central nave, was adapted to house Christian liturgy. Churches built in the Middle Ages and reformed during the Baroque period still follow this typology. The great cathedrals of Rome, such as St. Peter's and St. John Lateran, combine imperial monumentality with liturgical solemnity. Even thrones, pulpits, and altars inherited their forms from Roman tribunals and thrones. Today, when an artist seeks to express power through columns, authority through posture, eternity through marble, or ideal through the nude heroic figure, they are dialoguing with Rome. Cinema, advertising, graphic design, museums, and fashion continue to recycle and reinterpret Roman visual codes. The bronze statue, the monumental pedestal, the Latin inscription, the stylized toga, the temple with a triangular pediment, all these elements are reused as timeless signs of nobility, solidity, and glory. Thus, Roman art is not merely history, it is language, a language the West has never ceased to speak. Every neoclassical brushstroke, every academic sculpture, every logo inspired by columns or laurel wreaths reveals that Rome, even 2,000 years later, remains the standard of beauty, dignity, and power. And as long as there is an artist who seeks the eternal in form, Rome will live on, not as ruin but as symbol. Rome has fallen. Its emperors were assassinated, exiled, or forgotten. Its legions were defeated, its borders torn apart, its temples plundered, its institutions dissolved. And yet, Rome endures, not as a nation, not as an empire, but as the invisible foundation upon which the West has built its world. Rome ceased to exist politically in the year 476 after Christ, but culturally, linguistically, and spiritually, it never stopped influencing. And that is because Rome was not merely a place in space. Rome was and is a mental structure, a language of power, of organization, of beauty, of time, and of civilization. That is why even when we do not name it, we live within it. More than that, the Roman legacy is not a static inheritance. It is a code that the world continues to decipher, reinterpret, and reproduce century after century. The longevity of the Roman legacy is not explained solely by the strength of its institutions or the breadth of its territorial influence. It is explained above all by the fact that Rome knew how to transform ideas into systems, values into practices, myths into models. In building aqueducts, it also built permanence. In legislating, it also established universal principles. In teaching Latin, it also taught logic, order, form. In portraying its emperors, it also shaped archetypes of power. Rome thought big, but it also thought enduringly. And that durability has crossed the collapse of imperial structures, the Christianization of Europe, the Renaissance, modernity, and now, the digital age. In the era of artificial intelligence, social media, algorithms, and real-time globalization, Rome is still among us, not in marching legions, but in written constitutions, in civil codes, in state rituals, in everyday words, in urban monuments, in school calendars, in domes crowning parliaments. Rome is in the model of modern republics, in the architecture of courts, in the liturgy of the church, in the terminology of science, in the study of literature, in the layout of cities. Rome is in universities, in law schools, in college entrance exams, in libraries. Rome is in the ideals of citizenship, duty, honor, oratory, and merit. It is in the way we think of the past and in how we dream of the future. And perhaps it is precisely in the future that Rome is most present. For every civilization that seeks to organize itself, that wants to legislate, that aspires to stable architecture, that values memory and reason, ultimately rediscovers Rome. When a new republic is founded, when a Bill of Rights is written, when a capital is designed with monumental squares and symbolic axes, Rome is revisited. Even unconsciously, we still use Roman molds to structure our collective dreams. After all, there is no model more complete and tested for thinking about the state, language, law, and time. Rome survives because its structure is flexible. It does not demand absolute loyalty. It allows adaptation. That is why it can be Catholic or secular, classical or digital, monumental or symbolic. It can be evoked by a jurist citing Cicero, by a poet paraphrasing Horace, by an architect raising a column, by a programmer structuring code with logic and order. Rome today is a cultural archive continuously accessed by thinkers, artists, legislators, and citizens. It no longer needs emperors. It lives in the source code of Western culture, and for that reason, Rome will never end. Because as long as there is someone seeking justice, ordering time, writing with clarity, governing with balance, designing the world with proportion, Rome will be present in the corridors of power, on the stages of theater, on the altars of faith, in classrooms, in books, in the silence of libraries, in marble and in word, in the solemn gesture and in the written law. Rome, eternally alive, not only in the past, but in the now, and in all that is yet to come.